We're going to sing Sweet, Sweet Spirit tonight. It's number 243 if you prefer the hymn book. And to quote our musician, I finally got a good one, I think is the way she said it. So we're going to sing Sweet, Sweet Spirit. Stand with us as we sing and as we worship. Join us now as we welcome in fellowship.
Well, as as you're making your way back towards your seats today, tonight, we will take your prayer concerns and get them into the bulletin. 43. It's where we'll be at tonight. I'll tell you about something funny that happened to us at lunch today. We went to go eat lunch, and I was going to go see Keith afterwards, so we went towards Hickory to make it a little quicker for Dad to be able to get to the hospital and then get home to feed cows and all that fun stuff. But nevertheless, while we were eating at Chili's in Hickory, I saw two of my old youth, and they were eating with their wives and one of their kids. They were eating, and so walked over there to talk with them and catch up with them. It was Lee Shell and Casey Shell, for those of you know them. And so I was playing with Casey's little boy, Levi, and got up to walk away and come back over to our table, and this older gentleman stopped me. I mean, I was walking at a pretty good pace, with my long legs, and he started hollering at me and trying to flag me down. He said, "Sir, sir," and I was like, "Yeah." I said, "Can I help you?" And he said, "Are you our new congressman?" I've been mistaken at one time for some Marine sniper when I was at the hospital one time, and I was like, "No, that's not me. I'm sorry, that's not me." I said, I can barely shoot a gun, but I told him, I was like, "No, sir." I said, "I'm not." I said, "Actually, I'm a pastor." I said, "Those two don't go together," like that. Just sort of joking. And the guy sitting beside him said, "Oh, you got the Lord on your side. We don't know about the politicians," like that. And I just, and just sort of went on. So, never been confused for a congressperson, but congressman. So that was the first time for everything. Well, tonight we are, as I said, in Genesis chapter 43, as we continuing through this last section of the book of Genesis, and we're looking at this second trip that Joseph's brothers make to go back to Egypt to get food for their family, to get grain. And so, to keep us on track with the biblical timeline, most likely the chapter events of chapter 43 occurred during the second year of the famine, according to what we read later in Genesis 45:6. And so we know that these events occur sort of during the second year of the famine, meaning that the first trip to Egypt occurred during the first year of the famine. And this would be, as you see there on the screen, about 1656 BC, as best we know and as best we can sort of take a guess. And so tonight we're going to look at what happens in the build-up to to Jacob's sons going back to visit Joseph, and what happens once they get there. And so look with me at verses 1 through 5 in Genesis chapter 43. And we're going to look at the need for a second trip. It says, "Now the famine in the land was severe. When they had used up the grain they had brought back from Egypt, their father said to them, 'Go back and buy us a little food.' But Judah said to him, 'The man specifically warned us, you will not see me again unless your brother is with you. If you will send our brother with us, we will go down and buy food for you. But if you will not send him, we will not go. For the man said to us, you will not see me again unless your brother is with you.'" So the famine, which we already know was, according to Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dream, and from even now from scientific studies of that particular time period, we know that this famine was very, very bad. It was awful, and it must have been very severe in the area of Canaan, because Jacob's family had used up all of the grain that they bought basically in a year. They had run through it, and so when they were there that first time, that must have been what they bought was about a year's worth, and it may have been closer to a year and a half's worth. But they, with no crop production of their own, they probably had to use more of it. So they may have even bought as much as 2 years' worth while they were there, and they ran through it in a year. So Jacob tells his sons to go buy some more food. Go back to Egypt, buy some more food. And Judah steps up and reminds Jacob about Joseph's warning that unless Benjamin was with them when they returned to Egypt, the sons of Jacob would not even see Joseph. They wouldn't even see the man in charge unless he was with them, and therefore they wouldn't be able to buy any grain. And so Judah gives Jacob sort of an ultimatum. And he tells him, basically says, "Look, based on Joseph's demand, which he doesn't know him to be Joseph, obviously, he said, they will either go to Egypt with Benjamin or they will stay in Canaan with Benjamin. They're going to be wherever Benjamin's at because they're not going to go down there and risk being imprisoned as spies or anything like that unless they take Benjamin with them. And so, that's how the story this chapter unfolds. Now, I want you to think about something. We're focused, by reading this, we're focused on the events of what's going on most likely in Hebron of Canaan with Jacob and his family. But I want you to think about the events that are unfolding in Egypt while Jacob's family is using up their supplies in the course of about a year. And what's going on back in Egypt. Because Simeon, one of the 12, is living in an Egyptian prison for a year. He was probably hoping that Dad would have come to his senses, have a little reason, use a little logic, and send Benjamin back. And he thought, maybe I'll be here a month tops, because it's about a 15-day trip from Hebron to Memphis in Egypt, where Joseph would have been at. So it had been about a 15-day trip. So he's thinking maybe a month and a half at most in this prison. And he ended up spending an entire year in that prison. Now, granted, his prison experience was probably not like Joseph's prison experience, mainly because his younger brother was in charge of all of Egypt. So he probably got some favoritism shown to him during this time. But not only that, think about Joseph in Egypt during this year, probably scanning the crowds every day after about a month, starting to look for his brothers to return at any time. And so he's looking for them, probably waiting for them. And so Jacob in Hebron, or in Canaan, is really dragging his feet on this. And so let's look at verses 6 through 10 and see how Judah pleads with him to send Benjamin with them. It says, beginning in verse 6, it says, this is Jacob, or Israel, speaking. He says, "Why have you caused me so much trouble?" Israel asked. "Why did you tell the man that you had another brother?" They answered, "The man kept asking us and our family, is your father about us and our family, is your father still alive? Do you have another brother?" And we answered him accordingly. "How could we know that he would say, 'Bring your brother here'?" Then Judah said to his father Israel, "Send the boy with me. We will be on our way so that we may live and not die, neither we nor you nor our dependents. I will be responsible for him. You can hold me personally accountable. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, I will be guilty before you forever. If we had not delayed, we could have come back twice by now." So Jacob, really he had the famine not been so severe, he may have had a year and a half or maybe even 2 years of time to really think through, am I going to send Benjamin back or not? Maybe the famine would get better and I don't have to do that. He probably has all these thoughts, but he ran out of food in a year, and so he had to start realizing, as the supplies were dwindling, am I going to send Benjamin back or not? And so Jacob's issue with his sons at this point is that he wants to know why they told Joseph about having another brother. Why did you even tell this man about this? And the answer from his sons is that Joseph kept asking about Jacob and Benjamin, and they answered accordingly. But here's the thing, that answer isn't entirely true if you remember the last chapter, because they offered up that information in response to accusations that they were spies. And so it wasn't that Joseph saw them and then started asking these questions as much as they were like, no, sir, we're not spies. Don't throw us in prison. And so again, Judah wasn't exactly truthful in his answer to Jacob. But despite Judah's inappropriate relationship with Tamar, it seems like he has at this point repented and returned to living with Jacob and the rest of the extended family. And here in this moment, what we see is something surprising from Judah, that he sort of steps up and takes some leadership. this leadership among his brothers in trying to get their dad to understand really what was going on with them. And so he agrees to be held personally responsible if something happened to Benjamin. Despite the fact Benjamin was already probably about 24 years old and probably had kids of his own, Judah is talking about him as if he's a teenager or even like a 12-year-old, you know. And so by this point, Benjamin is a grown adult, probably has some kids of his own, and he probably feels like the odd man out that Dad and his older brothers are talking about him like he's a child, and he's not. But nevertheless, you know, Judah says, you can hold me personally responsible, which is a far cry from the offer that the oldest son, Reuben, gave, which was, you know, if I take Benjamin with us and something happens to him, you can kill my two sons, or two of my oldest sons. And, you know, Judah's just like, hold me responsible. Don't worry about my kid. Take the responsibility out on me. And then Judah kind of wisely starts to, you know, put the ending on his sales pitch here to his dad, and tells him, says, had we already left, we could have already been to Egypt twice and back. You know, I mean, we could have already made 2 trips to Egypt if we would quit standing around talking about what needs to go on. So look at verses 11 through 14 with me, and look at what when Jacob agrees to send Benjamin. It says, beginning in verse 11, then their father Israel said to them, if it must be so, then do this. Put some of the best products of the land in your packs and take them down to the man as a gift. A little balsam and a little honey, aromatic gum and resin, pistachios and almonds. Take twice as much silver with you. Return the silver that was returned to you in the top of your bags. Perhaps it was a mistake. Take your brother also and go back at once to the man. May God Almighty cause the man to be merciful to you so that he will release your other brother and Benjamin to you. As for me, if I am deprived of my sons, then I am deprived. So, interestingly, Jacob, when we've read this chapter so far, he's always referred to as what? Israel, right? He's not referred to as Jacob. He's referred to as Israel. And typically when we have seen that, especially in the stories about Jacob, it was done when he showed faith and some real spiritual prowess. He was referred to as Israel then, but when he acted very worldly, he was referred to as Jacob in the scriptures. And so when we read about him finally sending Benjamin to Egypt, there is little to imply that he is being a faithful spiritual leader in his family. There's been almost no mention of God or his provision through this process. And Jacob tells his sons that if they are going to Egypt, they need to take with them a gift from the land, a lot of produce, the silver that had been returned to them, the silver for new grain, as well as their youngest brother Benjamin. And the gifts, or the gift of products, included balsam, which is basically like a resin or a sap that's used as spice and medicine, honey, gum and resin, which is sort of the same thing as the balsam, and then pistachios and almonds, which are nuts. And so the only point where Jacob becomes anything remotely showing some spiritual awareness is in verse 14. He sort of haphazardly prays that God would make Joseph merciful toward his sons and return both Simeon and Benjamin to him. But we see this moment where we're like, oh, he's getting it together. He's acting like Israel, not Jacob. And he's praying that God would move in Joseph's heart so that his sons would be released. But then he sort of undermines that. He sort of, undermines this prayer with his last statement when he says, as for me, if I'm deprived of my sons, then I am deprived. Basically as if God's probably not going to do that, but, if he don't, I'll be fine. I'm just lose another son or two, sort of, almost like a sarcastic guilt trip towards God to take care of his son so he gets all his sons back. And, he in this chapter, Jacob is anything but Israel, I think is the best way of looking at it. So look on into verses 15 through 18, and this is where we see the sons arriving in Egypt. It says, the men took this gift, double the amount of silver and Benjamin. They immediately went down to Egypt and stood before Joseph. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to his steward, take the men to my house, slaughter an animal, and prepare it, for they will eat with me at noon. The man did as Joseph had said and brought them to Joseph's house. But the men were afraid because they were taken to Joseph's house. They said, we have been brought here because of the silver that was returned in our bags the first time. They intend to overpower us, seize us, make us slaves, and take our donkeys. So once again, 10 of Joseph's brothers left Canaan and headed to Memphis in Egypt. And this time they took Jacob's gift. They took the silver for the first load of grain, the silver for the second load of grain, and took Benjamin to Egypt. And after about 15 days, the brothers were once again standing in front of Joseph. And Joseph immediately recognized Benjamin. And if you think about it, Benjamin, it's surprising that he was able to recognize him, because Benjamin would have been a child, like a young child, when he last saw Benjamin, or when Joseph would have last seen him. So for him, it was a powerful moment because he recognized Benjamin in that moment. And so Joseph recognized Benjamin and told his servant some specific instructions about what they needed to do. They needed to go and take his brothers to the house. And so he sent them to his house and told his servant to prepare this meal. He was basically preparing lunch for them. And it's kind of interesting that Joseph's brothers realized how out of the norm this was for people to be taken out of the, hey, we're buying grain line, and be sent to Joseph's house. And, they knew, they had to be convinced that this could not be good. And they were most likely concerned that this was all about the silver that had been returned in their sacks of grain from the first trip. And they assumed, their first thought was, it's kind of crazy, but it shows you the world in which they lived in and how dangerous it was, that they were concerned that what was going to happen to them immediately was that they were going to be made into slaves, that was what it was about. And, they probably were pretty on edge from the time that they arrived at Joseph's house until the meal had been served, and really until Joseph revealed himself to be Joseph in front of them. They were probably scared that they were about to become slaves. And so look at verses 19 through 23, and we'll see that because of that fear of slavery, they start trying to talk their way out of this situation. It says, beginning in verse 19, it says, so they approached Joseph's steward and spoke to him at the doorway of the house. They said, my lord, we really did come down here the first time only to buy food. When we came to the place where we lodged for the night and opened our bags of grain, each one's silver was at the top of his bag. It was the full amount of our silver, and we have brought it back with us. We have brought additional silver with us to buy food. We don't know who put our silver in the bags. Then the steward said, may you be well. Don't be afraid. Your God and the God of your father must have put treasure in your bags. I received your silver. Then he brought Simeon out to them. So Joseph's brothers, they thought that they might be able to, kind of talk their way out of this. That if things were starting to go sideways, maybe if they explain the situation and tell the truth, which, for this group of brothers, them telling the truth, this is a rarity. But that's what they're doing. They're saying, look, we got to our first night's stop, and the silver was in our sacks. Somebody put it there. We don't know how this happened. And, that's probably one of the few times they've been truthful in this entire life of Joseph that we've been looking at. But they tried to explain to him so that they could get out of the possibility of being made slaves. And so they start making their case, and they explain all of this stuff to them. And they even told him that they've brought more silver to buy grain with this time. And Joseph had evidently, from what we see in this conversation, we see that Joseph had a spiritual impact on the people around him. He had a spiritual impact on his steward or his servant, his slave, however you want to phrase that. But he obviously had prepared his servant for how to respond to his brothers. And because he's talking about God and how God had put the silver back in their bags. But this, also implies that Joseph may have told his servant about his family's faith and about his family's God. And so Joseph, even though he's in the midst of this country where he is a foreigner, where he is, there's the worship of false gods everywhere, and where he was probably at times expected to sort of fall in line with that, we see that he has remained true to God and has even rubbed off on his servant to the point where his servant is confident about talking about God to Joseph's brothers. And so the servant just sort of chalks up the return of the silver to a blessing from God. That's sort of the way that it's put. And then we see that he brings Simeon out. Now let me ask you, do you think that seeing their brother Simeon was maybe a little bit of a relief that maybe we're not going into slavery? Because if we were going into slavery, they would have just sent us to where he's at, maybe not bring him out to us. But nevertheless, they're still on edge because they don't know what's going on. But look at verses 24 through 34 with me, and we'll look at this last bit of text. It said, and this is where Joseph actually eats lunch with his brothers. Beginning in verse 24, it says, the steward brought the men into Joseph's house, gave them water to wash their feet, and got feed for their donkeys. Since the men had heard that they were going to eat a meal there, they prepared the gift for Joseph's arrival at noon. When Joseph came home, they brought him the gift they had carried into the house, and they bowed to the ground before him. Remember, this is the second time they're bowing before him in conjunction with the second dream of them bowing before him. But nevertheless, it says that he asked if they were well, and he said, how is your elderly father that you told me about? Is he still alive? They answered, your servant, our father, is well. He is still alive. And they knelt low and paid homage to him. When he looked up and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, he asked, is this your youngest brother that you told me about? Then he said, may God be gracious to you, my son. Joseph hurried out because he was overcome with emotion for his brother, and he was about to weep. He went into an inner room and wept there. Then he washed his face and came out. Regaining his composure, he said, serve the meal. They served him by himself, his brothers by themselves, and the Egyptians who were eating with them by themselves, because Egyptians could not eat with Hebrews, since that is detestable to them. They were seated before him in order by age, from firstborn to the youngest. The men looked at each other in astonishment. Portions were served to them from Joseph's table, and Benjamin's portion was 5 times larger than any of theirs. They drank and became drunk with Joseph. So Joseph's brothers are taken to Joseph's house, and they're allowed to get cleaned up, to wash their feet. And the servants was taking care of their donkeys. And the brothers put their gift on display. They made it ready to be presented to Joseph whenever he arrived at noon. And, for Joseph, I'm sure that these gifts that they brought, they had to bring back, sensory memories for him. The taste of the pistachios or the almonds, the smell of, the resins and things like that. And so when Joseph arrived, they gave him the gift and once again bowed to him, as I said, fulfilling that second dream from Joseph's teenage years. But Joseph, again, seemed to be talking small talk with them, but was actually inquiring about his dad and making sure that this young man with them is who he thinks it is, and that it really is Benjamin. And once Joseph is able to speak with Benjamin and confirm that that is who it is, even though he's already recognized him, he's overcome with emotion, realizing that all these other guys are his half brothers, but this one is his only true brother from Rachel. And for him, it is a powerful moment because Benjamin had nothing to do with him being sold into slavery. It was the others that did this. And so here he is, seeing his brother, and he's overcome with emotion. And Joseph actually has to leave the room. He leaves the meal and goes to an inner room. He weeps and is crying and has to compose himself, washes his face. And Egyptians back then did wear makeup at times. And so he may have even had to reapply makeup that had been messed up because of him crying. Excuse me. So he gets himself composed, and he comes back to the room where the meal is at. And when he enters the room, he orders that the meal is to be presented or served to the people. And the interesting thing that I read this week is why it tells us that there was a table for Joseph, a table for the Egyptians, and then a table for Joseph's brothers. And I mean, we read in there what it says about how the Egyptians thought that Hebrews were detestable. Actually, it's kind of more interesting than that. Egyptians just basically thought they were better than everybody else. I mean, that's just what it is. Everybody else was despicable, detestable. We can't eat with you. We really can't associate with you. We're definitely not going to eat with you type of people. That's what the Egyptians really felt, was that whether they were Hebrews or whatever other nationality, if you weren't Egyptian, you were a second-class citizen. That's basically the view. And it's kind of interesting that even though Joseph had an Egyptian wife and partially Egyptian kids, and he was the number 2 man in all of Egypt, he still couldn't sit at the Egyptians' table. They still held it against him that he was not a natural-born Egyptian, I guess you would say, because he was a Hebrew. And so, they set up these 3 tables. Joseph's brothers are at one, Joseph is at one, and the Egyptians that were eating with them were at another. And, this is a moment when Joseph has a little bit of fun with his brothers, and he sticks it to them a little bit more, and he has them seated in birth order. And that, it says that they were astonished. They were freaking out, I'm sure, that they could not understand. How in the world did this happen? This doesn't just happen by chance. And trying to figure out who had said something or how they would know to put them in this order. But they are pretty well shocked. And then the interesting thing about it is that that should have tipped them off that there's something different about this guy. Plus all the questions about your dad and your other brother, and now your other brother's here, and then the other brother shows up, and he gets 5 times as much food as everybody else. Joseph is giving them every hint in the world as to who he is, and so they should have figured this out. Misty and I were eating supper the other night, and she had ordered chicken tenders, and we were sitting there, and I told her it was the day I had studied this part of the message for tonight, and I told her, I said, can you imagine? I said, whatever her order was, she had like 5. I think it had 5. It came with 5 chicken tenders, and like 4 of them went home with us for leftovers, but nevertheless, there were 5 chicken tenders there on the table. I said, Misty, I said, imagine if this were the story that we're looking at on Sunday night, and Joseph would have given you 25 chicken tenders and everybody else got 5. That's just a little hinky there. There's just something that's not right about that situation. They should have picked up on it, and they didn't. It would be something like that, but. Eventually for Joseph's brothers, the fear of slavery had to be subsiding for them. And those fears were probably leaving with every glass of wine that they were downing because they drank so much that they ended up getting drunk with Joseph. And so we find ourselves sort of at that tipping point in the story where Joseph is ready, he's all but ready to reveal to them who he is and what's been going on, but that is the study for next week. And so tonight we're going to look at the lesson that we learned from Joseph. And in chapter 43, the lesson that we learn here is that we should look to God's sovereignty over our situation and not chance or luck or fate or destiny, because Jacob had about a year to realize that God was orchestrating the events surrounding his sons going back and forth to Egypt. And instead of coming to the realization, hey, God is doing something here, what we see is that Jacob really continued to make it all about him and what somebody did to him, so to speak. How, this is happening to me. Why am I losing my sons? And, and just carrying on. Jacob only mentioned God in this whole time, really a whole year of trips and things like that. He only mentions him when he prayed in verse 14, when he said, may God Almighty cause the man to be merciful to you so that he will release your other brother, talking about Simeon, and Benjamin to you. He didn't seem like he had very much faith that God would answer that prayer, since he followed it up, as I said earlier, with that, as for me, if I am deprived of my sons, then I am deprived. It sounds like he was really just giving lip service to God rather than truly praying that God would influence Joseph's heart towards his sons. But from Jacob's perspective, God is basically left almost completely out of these events surrounding these trips for his sons back and forth to Egypt. And so if we could ask him at that moment what he thinks is going on, what's happening, to orchestrate and happen here, I'm sure he would have probably blamed some of those things that people regularly blame, such as fate or destiny or even bad luck. And, when we see the way things are happening around us, we have to be reminded as followers of Christ that God is sovereign over our situation. Whether that, whatever that situation looks like, we have to remember that God is sovereign, meaning that he is in control. He has complete rule over. That's what sovereign means. You have complete rule over something. And so God has complete rule over our situations and the situations that we find ourselves in. We cannot allow ourselves to fall into the mindset of so many people in the world, and sometimes even well-intentioned Christians, who fall into the mindset of, where they're going to blame their situation on some man-made philosophies. Because what will happen is they'll blame bad luck. And finish this statement. If it weren't for bad luck, what? I wouldn't have any luck at all, or there wouldn't be any luck at all, right? And that's the thing. Luck means that if luck existed, luck doesn't exist. But if luck did exist, good or bad, it would mean that God was not in control, meaning that it was just open to chance to happen. And it happened good for us or it happened bad for us. And so luck is not, shouldn't really be in the vocabulary of the Christian. Are we fortunate? Yes, we are. Are we lucky? No, because that implies that God is not in control of the situation. But not only do we hear people blaming things like luck or bad luck, but they blame it on coincidence or fate or destiny or any number of those things. And the reality is those are man-made philosophies or ideals that don't compute with the Christian understanding of God's sovereignty over our situation. And so in reality, we should know that every situation in our lives, whether we would label them as good or bad, because that's our perspective, is that it's either a good situation or it's a bad situation. But regardless of that, we should know that every situation in our lives has come through God's hands before it reaches us. Basically meaning that because of God's sovereignty and him being in control of it, the events in our lives are not just haphazardly happening to us, but instead God is allowing it into our life, whether we view it as good or whether we view it as bad. And so what it means is that when we have, what we know is that with God being sovereign, with him having that complete rule over every detail and event in our lives, we have to give him credit for that. We have to give him credit when things are good. We don't give him blame when we see things as being bad. But we have to understand that he is in control, whether it is what we see as good or whether we see it as bad. What that means is that when we have what we describe as good things to happen, God was responsible for bringing them or allowing them into our life. And when we have what we would describe as a bad thing to happen in our life, God was still responsible for allowing that into our life. And so whether it is deemed as good or bad by us because we want to put things on a scale, right? And is this a good day or a bad day? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Whether it's good or bad described by us, it is something that God is using to sanctify us, that process of being made holy and being set apart for Him. But it's also those things are also used by Him to bring Him glory. And we shouldn't rob ourselves of that growth that comes through that sanctification process just because we don't like the situation that we're involved in at the time. You know, we can't look at it and just naturally chalk it up as being bad and, well, there's no good that can come out of that. God can use what we term as a bad situation in our life. He can use it, as Romans 8:28 tells us, for our good. But it's not always just for our good. It may be for the good of those around us. And it may be somebody that we don't even know that is impacted by it. And so we need to understand that God's using that to mold us and make us into the image of Christ. But it's also He's bringing or allowing those things into our life so that He will be receiving glory from the way we handle those situations and the way we point others to Him during them. So that is our lesson on Genesis chapter 43 for tonight. Are there any questions about the text or the study? No questions? All right. Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate you guys being here. And Wednesday night we'll be wrapping up 1 Thessalonians in our Discover series. And so we'll be in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, and the week after that we'll start into 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. But I hope that you'll be here for this Sunday's or this Wednesday's Bible study. Next Sunday is Baptist Men's Day, so just a reminder to our men that if you weren't able to make it to choir practice today, we can use your help next Sunday. Choir practice at 9:15 like normal to sort of have a refresher, and then the men will be in the choir on Sunday. Sunday during the message will actually be the last one in our Gospel in the Gospels series, and we'll be looking at the restoration of Peter following or when he's walking with Jesus on the Sea of or next to the Sea of Galilee. And so next Sunday night we'll be in Genesis chapter 44. So that's where we're headed in the next couple of times. Yes, the men will have breakfast on Sunday morning. The younger guys there in the back are like, breakfast. Yeah. Breakfast for the men, Baptist men, is next Sunday morning at 8 o'clock. So be sure to be here. Guys, and you can bring your kids and enjoy a breakfast with us. And so looking forward to that next Sunday. So with those things being shared, I'm going to ask Daryl if he'd close us out with a word of prayer, and then we'll be dismissed.